Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 479th New Social Environment. I'm Anya, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Johnson Chang, David Humphreys, and Paul Gladston. We're thrilled to welcome poet Maw Shein Win here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on the Napehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions, which I will post shortly. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Curator and gallerist Johnson Chang is the founder of Hanart TZ Gallery in Hong Kong, is a co-founder of the Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, and is a guest professor of the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou. He's been active in curating Chinese exhibitions since the 1980s and was co-curator of the Guangzhou Triennial in 2008, the Shanghai Biennale in 2012, and East Meets West at Saatchi Gallery in 2014. David Humphreys works with the Australian corporate regulator, ASIC. He completed a Master of Laws at the University of Hong Kong. Prior to his regulatory role, David was for 19 years a political officer with the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. His last posting as a diplomat was as consul in Hong Kong in the years before and after the 1997 handover. And critical theorist and cultural historian Paul Gladston is the inaugural Judith Neilson Professor of Contemporary Art at the University of New South Wales. He was previously Professor of Contemporary Visual Cultures and Critical Theory and Director of the Center for Contemporary East Asian Visual Cultures at the University of Nottingham. So please, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you very much, Anya. Before I bring us to our panelists tonight, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Gadigal land in Sydney and that sovereignty over that land was never ceded. It's a great pleasure to be introducing this panel, which has returned by popular demand as a second edition of an initial panel we did, I think in October last year, with the Rail on abstractions in Chinese visual culture and aesthetics. And some of the response we got to the initial panel was very positive, and we thought it'd be a good idea to explore what is a very rich and diverse subject just a little bit further. We will be doing some other panels, hopefully on other aspects of Chinese visual culture and aesthetics, but for today we return to this broad idea of abstractions. Those of you who attended the first panel will know that we explored the idea of abstractions in different ways. Abstract visuals in visual art, abstraction as a way of taking things from one place or one thing to another, and ideas of abstract thought and abstract thought related to practice, artistic practice. So we're not just alighting on one simple meaning, certainly not one simple meaning about abstraction or non-figuration in art, but how that relates to kind of wider notions of abstraction, particularly in a kind of transcultural context. And if you were here for the first panel, you'll be very familiar with Johnson, who spoke very eloquently after some technical difficulties, which I hope we're not repeating tonight. But he spoke very eloquently about some of the historical background to Chinese visual culture and Confucianism and how that might be understood to relate to aspects of contemporary art, and particularly Chinese contemporary art, and its engagement with the legacy of abstraction. I'm also going to be talking to David Humphreys, who I think while he was a diplomat in Hong Kong became friends with Johnson, so they go back a little way. And we're going to talk to David a little bit later on about the relationship between Taoism and contemporary art, including contemporary Chinese art, and a further relationship to the writings of the philosopher Martin Heidegger. But first of all, to Johnson, who I'm just going to suggest he puts his, I think he's got his microphone on his iPhone. But I've got a couple of questions which he knows about. And this relates to a paper that Johnson gave at a conference last year, but I'd like him to kind of go over these again for the audience tonight. And it's really about different sites of display in relation to the Confucian tradition of aesthetics in Chinese cultures, and particularly distinctions between public and private sites of display. And Johnson, I'd like you just to perhaps begin by telling us a little bit more about that we might need to differentiate between different aesthetics in different contexts, and also how eventually how those ideas relate to broader questions of ethics, social organization and governance. But first of all, perhaps tell us a bit about these differing sites of display within Chinese culture, traditionally within Chinese culture.
The reflection on sites of display, of course, came out of my conversation with Paul related to the traditional Chinese site of display of art through the literati garden. However, the relation between the different, I should suppose say, aesthetic realms in the Chinese world, one can tie them together by speaking about the treatment of the soul. How does one treat the soul? Because that, of course, is a primary concern of art, the cultivation of the person. And in my paper about display, I looked at how a traditional educated cultured gentleman would enter this realm of what we call art today now through two major projects he would do in life. And they would be, the first, of course, is the art of calligraphy, because historically, calligraphy was the training that every learned person had to go through. And it was also a prerequisite to enter government service. In fact, calligraphy was not just writing, but beautiful writing. And it was actually considered important for seeking government office. So the aesthetics of calligraphy from the start was not only self-cultivation, but also a practical skill to learn. And so this gentleman will have this one major project in life, but not too late in life, he will start another art project, as we call it today, art. He would start constructing and preparing for his burial. And the burial would consist of employing various craftsmen, including painters and including sculptors. So the way I think we can tie these together is the burial, the burial process of the person involves an elaborate series of rituals and also preparation that would lead the body and the soul through to the next world. And when you enter the grave, it is actually a journey, and is often guided by series of murals in the grave, so that the soul will not lose its way. And at the end of the journey, when it settles down in the burial chamber, then he will be expected to rest there, and the soul will actually proceed back out from the grave to wherever heavenly realm he's destined to believe, depending on his belief. And in the Han Dynasty would have been to the West Heavens, and if it was a Buddhist, then it would be to somewhere else. But the process was pretty much the same. And this was actually a practice that lasted until very recently, the 20th century even. And of course, the preparation for the burial would not be as elaborate as in the old days. But what it means is that the preparation for the use of art in life and in death have something in common, because the cultivation of the spirit in life and the cultivation of the soul coincide with, firstly, with objects that he's used in life that they'll be buried with, and secondly, the language that describes how this person the language that's used to describe the journey of the soul are, in fact, coincide with language one uses in describing aesthetic terms, describing the essential aesthetic concerns in China, the movement of energy, the sense of journeying, and etc. Now, these are the two realms that this person would directly be related to: the earth realm, which is underground, and then the human realm. But then there's also the other realm, which is the realm of the heavenly realm, and that heavenly realm would be worship. I use the example of Mount Tai because of all the sacred mountains, or the 4 cardinal mountains of China, or 5, the East Mountain was always the most revered, and this is actually from very, very early prehistoric time. It has been memory preserved of worship of this mountain, and the way one accesses this mountain is also through a journey up a special path, and the path up the Mount Tai is now today flanked with boulders carved with calligraphy over the centuries. So it essentially served almost like an art gallery walking up this mountain. And the terms of describing how one accesses the mountain, and the way one speaks about the how the use of calligraphy cultivates the soul are essentially overlap. Again, going back to the human realm, although calligraphy was the important medium for training oneself to become an official, it was also the principal form of artistic practice, and that would happen in the garden, in the human realm. So basically, that was really the structure of the talk, and I used Chinese medical theory to ground these discussions, because even in the oldest, or in fact, one of the earliest texts, the classic of the Yellow Emperor, it is still used today by Chinese traditional medical practitioners. So it's still considered scientifically effective. And this medical classic, it refers a lot to the treatment of the soul, and also refers to the treatment of the will. So it is actually not just a biological manual, it is a biological manual that ties in with the entire being. And I thought this would be a very useful way to re-engage with aesthetic discussions because of the overlapping of terminology. So this is sort of that talk in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is crucially important, I think, to what we're talking about, that historically within imperial China, aesthetic practices, feelings are closely enmeshed with questions of social organization, of one's being in the living world, and also one's further journey into the world after death, and that this ties together in a way which is in some ways distinct from Western or Euro-American post-Enlightenment ways of thinking about the aesthetic, where the aesthetic is in some sense autonomous, or at least dislocated in a way that allows it to maintain a kind of critical position in relation to society. But certainly historically in China, there is a closer meeting or engagement between questions related to the aesthetic, even abstract feeling, and these very pressing issues about social governance and ethics. Just one more thing to Johnson. Do you think that some of the things that you've just been talking about, do they extend into contemporary Chinese culture?
Well, I think the relation to the preparation for the soul still actually is taken seriously in many parts of China. The aspect of worship is now changed quite a bit because of well, firstly, Buddhism is actually now much more the religious practice in China now, and Christianity, and they have very different views of history and relation to the cosmos. But all in all, I think this belief in the movement of energy in the human body and the movement of energy in the natural world, this understanding of how things actually are not all subsumed under humanism, that the world is actually a cosmos that we're only a part of. This is very much in the awareness of the culture in general. Today also we tend to try to divide Confucianist thinking and Taoist thinking, but in fact in the old days they were the same, and Lao Tzu was supposed to be the important minister of historical records, and and of course in the old days they also, and well, in the early historic times, they would say the emperor would be served by his soothsayer on the one hand and his historian on the other. In a way, the Taoists actually would be traced to the origin of the soothsayer and the historian, while the Confucian scholar, the gentleman that Confucius actually described and prescribed his behavior through the Book of Rites, were actually the governing bodies. They are the aristocrats and the training of the social order. However, there's also another, important overlap between what we now call the separation between Taoists and the Confucianists, is this overall overriding concern with rites and ritual. And today there's this unfortunate, I suppose, secularization of the word rite and ritual, li, to become manners or etiquette, when in fact li or rites was actually of a much broader concept, because li, if we look at the function of the ministry of Li in the old days. Now, the Ministry of Li actually existed even until the earliest 20th century, until the Qing dynasty collapsed. And if you look at what the Ministry of Li would, the function of the Ministry of Li was that it would oversee the examination system. That means the admission of officials. It would oversee education. And it, of course, oversee the official rights and the order of rights of the country. But it also would be involved in diplomatic services. So what this all really means is that, to use a now slightly, I don't know, maybe a slightly as kind of a derogatory term, is the Ministry of Ideology. It actually would be also the ministry that should be in charge of art, because art is about the order of forms, and Ministry of Culture through the ministering rites and ritual was actually where form is being observed and studied and cultivated. So That's why I feel that we should reconsider Confucian rites as a way to re-enter the discussion of Chinese aesthetics. Certainly, the study of the Chinese body.
You raised some very important points about the changing nature of the Chinese intellectual legacy, that certainly historically, within imperial China, Confucianism is a syncretic thing. It combines and overlaps with Taoism and Buddhism, and to some extent, Taoism provides a kind of intellectual substrate, which even exists in Confucian thought before Taoism, and also the basis for some kind of internal critique, some kind of self-reflexivity, where Taoists are continually criticizing, like Zhuangzi are continually criticizing overweening Confucianist rationality, that Chinese thought is not simply this set of non-rationalist thought, which it's often seen as from outside of China, but it's actually a kind of complex mix of differing intellectual attitudes that interrelate closely with one another, but are also critical of one another in some sense.
Yes, I think there is always a, I don't think one can call a traditional Chinese intellectual or Confucianist or a purely Confucianist or purely Taoist, because they always have both aspects in their learning. But certainly, it was the coming together of Taoist thinking and Confucianist thinking metaphysically after the Han Dynasty that created the major blossoming of metaphysics in China between the 3rd and the 5th century AD. So when we talk about philosophy now, I don't think one can separate clearly between Taoism and Confucianism.
Yes, I think that's right, even though there's sometimes a tendency to do so within a modernized context where this kind of rationalization of differing schools of thought happens across cultures. Historically, and I think presently, one can't disaggregate these things entirely. So bearing that in mind, let me turn to David. And David has been thinking and writing about the relationship of Taoism to contemporary art and contemporary Chinese art, and as we'll find out, a further relationship to the philosophical writings of Martin Heidegger. But let's just start with the Taoist part. David, can you tell us a little bit more about what you think this relationship between Taoism in its differing forms, what kind of relationship that has to contemporary art, and specifically Chinese contemporary art?
Right, I should introduce myself. I'm not an expert, I'm not an academic, and I don't have 50, 60 years of deep experience like Johnson in considering these issues. And I was very fortunate to come to this because I had the opportunity to meet some of the artists that Johnson showed at Hanart in Hong Kong in the late 90s. First, I should probably set the scene. I was interested in the way Chinese art contributed to abstract art generally. And the interesting thing for me was that Chinese Taoists were creating Taoist objects at least as early as the Tang Dynasty. So a deep interest in things like Guangzhou, scholars' rocks, and the art of people like Wang Wei, who was splattering ink on paper and silk in much the same way as some of the abstract expressionists in New York in the 80s. So the question is, for me, is abstract art itself embedded in Taoist thinking initially, and the fact that the West only came to abstract art in the years before the First World War, when Taoist ideas were starting to permeate in Europe and America. This is interesting too in the context of what Gao Minglu has said about the school of resonance, his view being that Chinese art, including maximalist art, not just the abstract, is infused with Taoism, Taoist precepts, and that we can come to what the Taoist precepts are and whatever, but so we have probably three different groups of Chinese artists, contemporary artists. Those that regard themselves as Taoist and practicing in the Taoist tradition. And I was lucky enough to meet through Johnson Chang, who was telling me that even as a child, he was going to Taoist monasteries, shrines, that his father was deeply interested in it, that he spent many years in the Sichuan area involved with Taoist monks, and that he now paints in a meditative state to try and capture what he sees as a pure Taoist view of the world. So that's the first group. There aren't that many artists, and Johnson will correct me if I'm wrong, that are pure Taoists, still practicing as Taoist artists in the Taoist tradition in the new China. Then there's a second group, those who say they are referencing Taoist ideas, people like Song Dong and Huang Yongping and Guwenda Xubing, those sorts of artists who are using calligraphy and infusing it with Taoist ideas, but who would regard themselves as creating a syncretism of Taoist Chinese art and Western postmodernist thinking. And then there's the third, those groups of artists who are the maximalists, those who would deny that they have any connection with Taoism, but who nevertheless, Gao Minglu would say, are extraordinary, exceptional, and producing art that no non-Chinese could produce and should be thought of in the context of the Confucian tradition.
It's worth just forgive me for interrupting, but those who came to the first panel will know about this because we went over it in some detail, but it's probably worth just backing up very quickly just to say what some of these Taoist principles are that we're talking about. And certainly as part of syncretic Confucian aesthetics, there's a couple of things we could make. We could mention a constellation of things, but a couple of things we could mention is this, an idea that's become associated with Taoism, which is this idea of a kind of fundamental resonance between all things that's universal and cosmological, often referred to as Qian Shindong in Chinese aesthetics, that there's a resonance between the artist, the subject, which is usually the landscape, the artwork, the means of producing the artwork, and then viewers. And that there's a kind of relay of resonances between all those things, which links them aesthetically and ontologically in some sense. And also ideas of absence and presence, xu, the resonance between areas that are untouched, which are in paintings, for example, or in rocks, absences of form that relate to presences of form in a sense which is meant to heighten the aesthetic resonance of those things. And I think what you're talking about in terms of these three different categories of art, it's their differing relationship to these historical ideas, historical aesthetics that we're talking about. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no. It's important to pull out these ideas. I think, you know, of course, the concept of qi, the resonance,
Yes.
the coming and going, the movement in the way we look at things and the way we sense things, the coming and going, the Lai Chu, the idea from Lao Tzu that the great image has no form, that it never fully forms, that it's unbounded, that it's not contained. The concept of blandness being important, Ping Dan Wu Wei, that it induces through blandness a sense of the uncanny, and this comes through very strongly in Heidegger. The sense of nature as being part of a oneness, and Johnson talked about that. The yin and yang, of course, the tracklessness, the perception of reality as a constant unfolding reciprocity. And interestingly, the Chinese white, Chunbai, which comes from Zhuangzi, which shows up in Dada and Duchamp's interest in the infra-thin, as sort of inducing a way through to consideration of the fourth dimension, or anyway, we might come back to that. What then, the other side, of course, of Gao Minglu's idea is that because Chinese art is exceptionalist, because of this Taoist element, on the other hand, Western art then becomes something that is different. And he says it's different because it's bounded. It doesn't have a sense of, it has a sense of containment, whereas Taoist artists, Chinese artists have a sense of uncontainment, of things in constant flux, of pure whiteness, of blandness being a path to the uncanny. And I don't think that's correct, but you may disagree. But because Western art and the abstract comes through Taoism indirectly, in the sense that the Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky, I don't know if anyone can untangle all her thinking on theosophy and isolate the Chinese Confucian Taoist elements from the Chan Buddhist and the Plotinus and the Neoplatonist ideas. I'm sure someone's tried it, but I couldn't. And then, as we mentioned, Duchamp's interest in the infra-thin. And then, of course, we come to Heidegger. And I think Heidegger is important because he informs a lot of Derrida's thinking on contemporaneity, being based in the uncanny, and Derrida's deconstructionalism, based in complex etymological examination of early and archaic thinking. And Heidegger comes to that in a way that's interesting because he doesn't acknowledge his borrowings from Taoism. There's very, very few references that I know of in Heidegger to Chinese thinking. His first explicit reference, I think, is in a lecture in 1930 in Bremen, where he brings up Zhuangzi and asks, in relation to discussion on truth, whether any of his students had read Zhuangzi, and they start discussing some of Zhuangzi's proverbs and draw out some of the thinking on truth in the context of nothingness and Nichtung being, in a sense, ideas from Taoism. And then he comes back to it after writing Sein und Zeit, just before the Second World War, where he is talking to for some time a Chinese philosopher working in Germany and lecturing in Germany, Paul Xiao, who spends a lot of time talking to Heidegger about the Tao Te Ching. And then during the war years, in 1942, for 3 months, they go to Heidegger's cabin in the Black Forest and work through a very intense discussion and a translation, if you like, of the Tao Te Ching into German. And then in 1946, Heidegger writes Hölderlin's hymn, The Ister, where he examines all these ideas about the etymology of ancient thinking and words, and this ties in with the Zhuangzi's writing on rationalism being something that gets in the way of pure thinking.
I think it's worth just kind of saying a little bit about Heidegger here, particularly this idea of Dasein and being in the world, that Heidegger was always questing for some non-abstract substrate as a way of, as a basis, if you like, although that's the wrong word, for becoming intelligible as being, that it's something before rationalism, as you suggest. And that this is a unitary concept. It's one that interferes with Cartesian distinctions between subject and object, which has become a kind of dialectical constant in Western philosophical thinking. And this, of course, is the relationship of Heidegger to deconstruction, where Derrida is similarly interfering with those dialectical oppositions. And I think although this is a complex area, and there is some emerging scholarship on this, there's been some books recently about looking at Heidegger's thinking in relation to East Asian thought. He was dialoguing with Japanese scholars, but the connection is between, it's difficult to alight on a single term, but yin and yang, this kind of reciprocal relationship between opposites that is runs through Taoist thought. Heidegger effectively thinking that there is a strong resonance between that and his idea of being in the world as this kind of non-abstract substrate. And therefore he was seeing a connection between the two that might then allow us to connect his philosophy as something which is seen as the basis for modern or contemporary aesthetics, or even postmodern aesthetics, and this connection that we've been making between art and Taoism. I mean, that's a very crude description, but I think that's the kind of basis that we're talking on.
Yeah, it's a very poetic way of looking at the world. So,
yeah,
and Heidegger is looking at the etymology of Greek words. So he's looking at the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus, Anaximander, Sophocles' Antigone, which he sees as a pure form of thinking. Interestingly, Sophocles' Antigone was produced about the same time as, I mean, Socrates would have been 29 when Antigone was first performed. And then Heidegger, his view is that Western thinking lost its way after Plato. So, and could only be rediscovered, the ancient thinking could only be rediscovered in its purity through poets and artists. So poets like Hölderlin and Paul Celan, he was impressed with the way their poetry gave him access to original deep thinking.
Tell us about the relationship between that and ideas of sublimity and the unheimlich, the uncanny in Heidegger's thought, because these are kind of
Heidegger's unheimlich is quite different to Freud's sense of the uncanny, and Freud's thinking more in terms of personal psychology and how that summons the uncanny, whereas Heidegger's unheimlich is he was always talking about following trails through dark forests to lit clearings. And the lit clearings were when the uncanny gave him access, or anyone, access to the knowledge of what it was to be. And Derrida later picks this up and says that after 1975, everything he wrote was concerned with the uncanny, that nothing could be truly contemporary unless it involved inducing the uncanny and using the uncanny to give access to what it was to be. I don't know quite if that answers the full question.
No, it does, because I think that idea of, and there are several versions of the uncanny, but certainly Burkean ideas of the relationship between the uncanny and sublimity have been followed through. There's a relay of thinking in this regard, which includes Heidegger, which sees that kind of disjuncture as our route into some kind of altered consciousness about the nature of being, or how being comes into being, about living, kind of an ontology of being in the world, which is not one of things being in joint, but out of joint. Yeah, and this is followed through by all sorts of people, including Duchamp and all sorts of modernist and postmodernist artists.
Yeah, especially Derrida's Spectres of Marx, where he is talking about, again, a poet inducing access to being, Shakespeare in this case in Hamlet, time is out of joint, the presence of the ghost and the interaction of the ghost with the characters in the play.
Coming and going behind the granulations. Exactly.
So in Derrida's terms, it's interacting with the ghost that induces knowledge of being and
spectral resonant presence.
Burke's more interested in terror and the reaction to horror. Terror. Yeah.
It's different variations. I mean, we're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about a relay of evolutions of ideas. I mean, certainly we could go back to the 18th century in Europe and certainly in England to find a time where there's a receptiveness to Chinese thought and the emergence of ideas of sublimity and the uncanny. Before you go on about this, let me just turn back to Johnson, and because Johnson wrote a very interesting little gloss on some of these points just before we came on air. Johnson, what do you think about this? Is it possible to make these connections between the Western ontological philosophical quest and this complex syncretic intellectual legacy in China? Can we see these as enmeshing with each other?
Yes, I actually was very impressed with what David had put down as notes. I basically made some reflections on what he mentioned and also illustrations of artworks he used. I think one thing that we can first go to is the artist Chu Shihua that David spoke about. He was absolutely right. Chu Shihua would be a very good example to speak to discuss on this issue, because he, unlike the subject we're talking about now, because we're talking about abstraction, he looks like an abstract painter, depicting mostly basically white plain. But in fact, he's probably the most visual painter in all the examples that David actually has shown us. Because from the angle of visuality, Chu Shihua is a master. We see things because we see the contrast between forms. And he manages to play with the contrast between forms and make things visible. And through that, he actually, through this this liminal point between vision and visuality and non-visuality, it opens up a form of vision. It opens up a world that we seem to see beyond. Now, if one takes a mobile phone or a digital instrument to look at Chu Shihua's paintings, we suddenly find them totally naturalistic, because the digital instrument basically enhances the contrast between forms. So, so this brings me back to this reflection about abstraction, because I've never thought about this relation between abstraction and Chinese art so seriously, because it is not the inclination to go to abstraction. But having gone on to this panel, I thought maybe we should clarify between this difference between images or patterns or drawings that you deduce from objective phenomena, even though it can be highly stylized or turn into more like a graphic form. Like, for example, the Ma Yuan's painting of waters that David also illustrated in our previous discussions. And there's difference between these kind of pattern making and patterns per se, or patterns which is purely abstracted from referencing the objective world. Now, this brings me back to a reflection of early Chinese art, from Neolithic art up through to even the Shang and Zhou dynasties. Because if we're talking about art, in China, if ritual objects is the most original aesthetic object in Chinese civilization, ritual vessels and the patterns on them would be the foundation of the Chinese civilizational aesthetics. But even though many of these vessels would imitate stylized forms of worldly creatures, fantastic beasts, well, faces of monsters. Now, these are all stylized into patterns, but to go from this kind of stylized abstract patterns to depicting figuration, actually was a big break, and that came starting, I think, really from after Confucius times. So this is interesting to think that it was actually abstraction that came before, and then to figuration, and then it never went back to this abstraction or pattern making, even though we know that in almost all spiritual and religious references, a picture making in the world, it is the patterns that actually become the spiritual art, especially in latter days, like they mentioned Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists. And of course, there was also the foundation of abstraction in 19th century European art, especially through Theosophists and Russian avant-garde, and came down to the modern days. So this is why we actually are interested in abstraction, because it is our form of our era of spiritual art. But in the Chinese tradition, this access to the spirit was always actually taken, or rather, ever since the Han Dynasty, it was taken actually through a side glance. You actually look at the representational world, and you actually glance at it from the corner of your eye in order to see the bigger spiritual vision. I think that is the interesting thing about Chu Shihua.
Or perhaps we're not talking about, perhaps there's a confusion of terminology here as well, that if we follow Heidegger, that these apparent pictorial abstractions are maybe meant to be indexes of something which is a non-abstract conditionality of being. that we're kind of thinking, if we're thinking of this in sort of purely westernized modernist terms, that we're kind of missing the more complex points about these relationships.
Of course, it is the indexing of something which is more than what we want to look at, and this indexing is also very interesting. It's also referenced by David's illustrations, because he showed us a scholar's rock. And
maybe we can pull them up, Anya.
Yeah, please.
The scholar's rock was slide 1. Apologies for the poor quality of the photos.
We can look at Chiu Hua as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
Just a moment while we bring it up.
Apologies, as Zoom doesn't want to pull up the correct slides. Give me one moment as I clear off my screen a bit. Apologies for this.
Just to say that the scholars' rocks that we're referring to were there it is. These are often objects associated with Confucian literati culture, which are taken or abstracted from nature and are meant to be objects of aesthetic contemplation, related to some of the kind of Taoist and Confucian literati ideas we've been talking about. Anyway, on you go, Johnson.
Yeah, and they're found objects, so they're not enhanced,
yes.
or they technically shouldn't be enhanced.
They're meant to be
sure
found objects. Yeah, exactly.
So they were to induce these following of the numinous in Western terms.
Sense of resonance with the work.
The resonance, yeah. So the second slide was Maw Yuan's Waterscapes. So these are Southern Song dynasty. So this is like, what, 1,000 years ago?
Yeah.
You know, it's incredible. This was, you know, the first abstract art in the West is produced in Hilma af Klint and Kandinsky, Malevich, whatever. But here were images that were almost abstract in our terms 1,200 years ago. Then we have, may as well show them in order, slide 3, Shunfan. Again, this is energy being uncontained but gathering, so the sense of energy moving in space. And Shunfan would say he was reflecting a lot of Taoist precepts in his work, although he's not a practicing Taoist in the way Chiu Hua is. Then we have, what do we have? This is Chiu Hua. So this is an image of a painting, an early one. So this is 2003, early in terms of his showing in the West, in one of the Uli Sig donations to M+ Museum in Hong Kong. But you can get a sense of, this is one that does have connections to landscape and realism, and you can see the forms. But as his work goes on, and in the last 10 years or so, a lot of his paintings, you can't see the forms at all, and you start to panic. But you know there are forms there because that's the way he works, but you just can't get any cues into them. So it becomes a question of belief rather than an interesting point. You know, is it still a landscape when you can't see any forms, or is it an abstract painting? And then the one after that is slide 5. This is where I've massively enhanced the contrast. So, so when people look at a painting like this, a lot of people just think you've got a moldy surface. You've got what the Chinese call Chinese white surface, a chunbai surface, and yet your eye moves with the concentrations of energy in the painting, and that starts to create forms. I think now his work is incredibly fine layers of very, very thinned primary colors. So red, green, blue, where the canvas still comes through the emulsion and gives you the light that gives you the whiteness. And they have a sort of porcelain look because of that. I'm sure Johnson could explain it much better. And
it's just as a response to one of our audience who's kind of looking for fine distinctions. I think we're really looking at a spectrum of abstractions and relative abstractions, because of course the first image we looked at is representational, and arguably the other images are representational, but we're thinking across a range of abstractions here, not just absolutist distinctions between the figurative and the non-figurative.
No, but we look at, oh, sorry. But if we actually look at Chiu Shihua's two paintings, both of them are actually not non-representational. They both refer to language. And knowing him well, because I actually gave him his first exhibition doing this type of landscape, he has actually never actually painted anything that is not representational, which are not an landscape. And even though the landscape might be something that he imagines and not visible in front of his eyes, but it is always about the relation between visuality and vision. It is through this faint line between what we're seeing and not seeing that you actually see something more. In that, I think it's interesting to contrast Chiu Shihua with the Scholar's Rock, which we just saw. But you know, what is how do we understand the Scholar's Rock? Because it is a rock. I mean, it's totally realistic. It is a natural substance. It is nothing has even been done to it. Well, sometimes people actually enhance it and make it more like a rock. So that is another issue. Now, but Scholar's Rock is actually an object contemplation. It is something for aesthetic connotation. So what is the aesthetics trying to get at? And in fact, the contemplation uses the same word which Lao Tzu used. It is the inert form. There are two words in Chinese for this. Pu. They're both pu, and also they use the same radical, except for the psi radical, meaning either an uncarved block of wood or untreated raw jade stone. So as an object of contemplation, it functions more like the elementary geometric forms for the Egyptians and Greeks, except that the inert form is even more fundamental than geometric forms, because it has not been distilled into ideal shapes like the circle or the triangle. And this is actually the thinking I was just drawn to before showing the images, between the relation between patterns on ritual vessels and the gradual turn towards figuration. But this figuration was never stylized, but was actually transformed in different ways to turn into the spiritual landscape paintings. So as an object of contemplation, the rock, like the landscape, is still something from the world. It is not an abstract form like the geometric shapes. So what this pool is supposed to hint at is it concerns being with a capital B, where the foundation of all phenomenal beings. And this echoes the philosophical concern of Heidegger. Well, since we cannot speak about being, it needs to be assessed through the phenomenal world. And for Chinese culture, the rock or the uncarved block of wood becomes the preferred object of contemplation along this line. But one issue which has always intrigued me is how to define a good rock, a good form for this natural rock, or a beautiful form this natural rock. And certainly, we know certainly not just any rock will do, because it is an aesthetic choice at the end of the day. So if you speak about aesthetic choice, then firstly, we need to think what we should refer to and not refer to. The natural rock should never refer to the semblance of creatures. People may say it hints at mountains, which would be the nearest thing one is allowed to speak about. And yet, even when a rock is to be approached as this, as we use the word abstract shape, every refined rock connoisseur has in his mind some forms that makes a rock more desirable. I mean, for lack of, I'm not trying to use the word beautiful or good, make a rock more desirable than others. And there must be only a finite set of forms, since he knows what is undesirable. And as we know, how to identify this set of forms has been attempted by collectors over the centuries, because we have handed down to us famous rock manuals. They're trying to define the genealogy of exotic rocks. Now, the interesting speculative question that I've had in my mind for a few decades is it legitimate to claim that there exists a set of preferable forms that define the sense of form of a particular civilization, like the Chinese civilization? If so, that this set of desirable forms of rocks would be the Chinese sense of form, because one chooses these forms out of countless, infinite set of things. But this must be also, this choice of this sense of form of Chinese must be also different from that of other cultures, like the Greek preference of geometric forms. So to take this thought a bit further, if this was true, would this then mean that the effort to grasp being with a capital B, the fundamental ungraspable support of all beings, is a culturally defined aesthetic project? And there are approaches to this project and leading to different aspects of the truth. And I wonder if one can interpret Heidegger's concern with home from this angle. But however, I certainly do not agree with what you wrote, what you quoted from Gao Minglu, that cultural knowledge cannot be grasped by and shared by other cultures. I mean, human beings have been known to be the learning beast, and we have always learned from each other from time immemorial.
We're running out of time a little bit, and I just have one question to pose to both of you, which I'd be great if you could answer fairly succinctly. But just to follow up on your thoughts, Johnson, I think, you know, we're certainly not talking in terms of ideal Platonic forms in relation to scholars' rocks. There's perhaps something more of the capacity of the literatus to bring the disordered human mind into accordance with the way of nature. And of course, that's ineffable. There's no real way of codifying that, or no way of idealizing that ultimately. It's a kind of esoteric judgment in a certain sense. But the question I want to ask you both is, isn't this all deeply unfashionable now? You know, we live in very tough times. Art has turned very much towards questions of social engagement and, you know, critical relationships to the world as it is now, and questions of the transformation of the world. What does all of this kind of esoteric discussion, including Heidegger, what use is this now to contemporary art? Does it have any sort of use or value for us?
I would say, you know, the world more than ever needs a poetical way of looking at reality and truth and being, and you know, I think postmodernist, post-structuralism still has a huge role to play in the way we deal with reality.
Johnson, what do you think?
Well, Heidegger was always terrified by the notion that technology would replace philosophy. And it is exactly this kind of instrumentalized thinking that obsessed with predetermined ends that actually blocks the way to real thinking, to philosophy. And to open up that thinking is very important, and it is exactly what art tries to do.
Yeah, I'd add that Heidegger, in Questions on Technology, the question of technology, his view was that technology was a form of narcolepsy, that a sort of white noise that distracted people from thinking about the really important things.
I think just to cap that off a little bit, although it's impossible to cap this discussion off really, one might argue that the kind of deconstructive effects of language that certainly Derrida refers to and that Heidegger points towards are readily witnessable. And equally within the Chinese intellectual tradition, the resonances that we've been discussing are supposed to be readily witnessable or felt. They're not abstract, as we keep saying. They refer back to some non-abstract condition. Anyway, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm going to go over to Anya, who may have some questions from the audience. I've been reading some of them and observations that are being made, which are absolutely fantastic. So do we have anything we can put to our esteemed panel?
Yes, we do. We have a question from our friend G.E. Schwartz, and you can turn on your microphone now.
Thank you so very much for this discussion, and it's taking us in so many wonderful areas beyond philosophy and art and everything. Can you talk about the concepts of Hun and Po, the two pivotal concepts that have been and sort of remain today? And are they a key at all to understanding Chinese views of the human soul, the afterlife, and of course, the creation of art?
Johnson?
Yes, the relation between Hun and Po are the two spiritual aspects of the body that we cannot actually just define as a biological entity, but it is actually part of a core part of the Yellow Emperor's classic of medicine. It is actually the treating of these two aspects of the soul that is the most important. And Bo is the living energy. It is the drive that drives you. Well, the most basic drive, this sexual urge, is part of the Bo energy. But interestingly enough, in this classic, the Hun is supposed to be the yang energy, even though it is something that preserves you. So it's a reverse way we think, which is active and inert. And the Hun energy, the Hun part of the soul, that's what you actually have to preserve when you go to burial, and what you want to bring forward to its next stage in as part of its role in the cosmos. And I think through this type of, through medicine, I think would be the one way to deliver Chinese, interest in Chinese thought out of the more poetic, metaphysical way of speaking about it, because Chinese traditional medicine is effective, so it proves itself. And this discussion of the Hun and the Po would have some sort of truth, although it may need to be redefined in contemporary terms. So I think in that aspect, the relation between the cultivation of the soul and the artistic cultivation would have some relevance.
I think it's important just to add to that within the Chinese, well, intellectual and practical tradition, that there are a constellation of intersecting ideas and practices that differ from one another, but if you want to put it in Derridian terms, also differ, or in Taoist terms, resonate with one another. So when we're talking, as Johnson eloquently put it, when we're talking about Hun and Paul, we're also talking about yin and yang and a whole bunch of other terms which are part of the Chinese intellectual tradition, but that can be discussed in variegated ways. And I think that's something which maybe even Heidegger's trying to get at.
Thank you
Any
so
more
much,
questions, Anya?
GE. Yeah, we have a question here from Fong Bui. Sorry, I was just looking. You can turn on your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. David and Johnson, we need to continue till the cows come home, you know?
Yeah.
Very deep discussion. Can't be just make it so contained. You mentioned the word containment before, which is so interesting right now in a minute, because I'm reading John Lewis Gaddis' biography of George F. Kennan, who's famous for 1946 containment policy that trying to deal with the expansion of communist Soviet Union. And it's something that we miss his wisdom, actually, because he's really thinking in the grand strategy, you know, looking back, deep philosophy, Greek civilization philosophy, and literature before coming to social science, which is a later invention. But it's so interesting to think, you also mentioned of Heidegger. I can't help to think also one of the great attraction to Heidegger, in addition to his disdain for technology, right? That's why he hated the United States and Soviet Union. Just as much as Cézanne quoting, I think once, actually it was Heidegger who in the conversation with one of the surrealist painter, where he really cited Cézanne for the similar aspiration for his own hatred for the soap factory being built in his site of painting landscape in Saint-Provence. You know, it's so interesting that they have similar commitment, which go back to Heidegger heroes, which is Nietzsche's, and then Nietzsche's going further back to Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
The first Western philosopher in the 19th century ever really translated Hindu and Buddhist texts into German. And I think that was very important to be reminded that to live according to Schopenhauer, I remember reading years ago, is to will. And to will is to participate in fully one's own anxiety. You have to participate in your own anxiety to feel the fullness of the suffering in yourself. And it's interesting too, I've been thinking about a little bit, because you also mentioned Madame Blavatsky theosophy as an attraction is trying to unify or bring together the synthesis of Western and Eastern thinking, more or less, you know? And I think that was very important to the beginning of modern art, because when you think about theosophical society, the member who were involved was not just Mondrian and Kandinsky, there was Thomas Anderson, you know, and other American of that incredible lavish energy at the time of the tail end of the 19th century, because I think she died in 1891, 92. But the influence was so epic. My point is very simple. I think when one look at the body of Christ on the cross, and then you look at the image of Buddha under the Bodhi tree, one is crying out for seduction of the body, the emphasis of individuality, while the other one is trying to reach nirvana, which is being not there at all. And I think that is a very confusing comprehension on those people who don't understand deeply in the two, although they share incredible parallels because I'm also now rereading Pico 900 Thesis, which is what we now call the Manifesto of the Renaissance, where he advocated for grand strategy. This is so interesting right now where we are in America, because the education system is reduced to specification. People who want to enter to the field of study of philosophy and all the broadness of knowledge is being told to study something very specialized. So they don't understand grand strategy mean, that philosophy doesn't mean anything, forget about literature, So I think it's so interesting right now, the spiritual discipline and all of that greater, broader of thinking, the oration of the dignity is something that the education system have to adjust. I agree completely what this discussion is about, and we need to continue because it's eminently important. And I think Johnson was so right about the whole idea of containment and the uncontainment. And you too, David. I'm so impressed by you. Of course, we know Paul is a serious scholar, but we need to understand the autonomy of art. Where does that go? Because at the moment, I've just reread last night of Walt Whitman, Democratic Vistas. It's spiritual and emotional. It's not intellectual. It's over the place. It's not, of course, you remember, it was the response he wrote in due to the attack of Thomas Carlyle of Democracy. So it's really interesting how the emotion of this vast cosmic optimism of knowledge is not being reduced to one specific study or scholarship, pursuit of such. That's going to get you anywhere that close to wisdom. And I think that is so interesting as a topic where we are now. So I would request that we should continue part 2.
Yes.
Forever, I would love to hear more about this, because right now, thinking about a certain artist we know, whether Bill Jensen or Bryce Martin, who really practice in the tradition of calligraphy and Taoism in some aspect too, I know they are very seriously committed to Chinese poetry and philosophy. And I would like to open up, maybe the next time we talk, let's bring some of the artists and some of the poet translator, David Hinton, Red Pine, and others among people we know, and some of the artists too, if that's appeal to you.
I think that's an important point. I mean, there are some more of these planned in the series where we do bring artists in, but I think this particular discussion that we've had today and we had in the last panel, I think bringing artists more fully into the discussion, I think would be extremely helpful, because as you quite rightly say, we're not really talking about something which has a defined beginning or end. This is an illimitable relay and could be talked about in myriad terms. So I think we have hit on something which could be discussed usefully in an extended series. I think a key point here is not succumbing to the rather instrumental and over-rationalized ideas of the aesthetic, which have taken hold in the art world over the past couple of decades, where they're towards particular ends and don't have this more kind of subtle or nuanced discussion of what the aesthetic can be and how it can relate to society, not to be entirely esoteric, but can have a direct impact on the way that the world works, how society is organized, and how it develops. So yes, I think this is an open-ended series.
Thank you, Paul, because I think to David's point, as much I also am very invested in Derrida, who I met once or twice. Our dear friend, beloved friend, Souvia Lokshinje, who died recently, we're going to pay tribute to him, who really responsible to having brought French structuralist philosophy to America, particularly in New York for sure when he was teaching at Columbia. The interesting to know and to be reminded that the aspiration was through philosophy of action that implement protest and get students to activate their sense of protest. And that had failed by the time the Vietnam War ended here in 95, 75, you know? So I think we had to rethink about what that meant when the partaking of that philosophical reading of structuralism and post-structuralism into the academy and be insular. This is something that I also am very, appreciate of Richard Rorty's book, Achieving Our Country, 1997. So we need to think about all of these amazing, greater grand strategic point about culture and history and all of it, the humanity for sure. So we continue.
The attractive thing about deconstruction, of course, is that it looks towards its own deconstruction. Beyond itself. It's not a philosophy which wants to rest on its own laurels. It's not even a philosophy and doesn't have any laurels as far as I can see. Look, I think that's fantastic, Phong. I think we need to move to our poetry reading now. I certainly have to, because I've got something else to do in about 10 minutes, unfortunately. I could talk about this all day.
Yes, we can.
We'll come back to this. We can come back to this.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, David. Thank you,
Not
Johnson.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Thank
Anya.
you all. Thank you, Phong, for your questions or for your comments and this wonderful discussion. Yeah, we're all looking forward to part 3 and beyond. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending these community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate, Maw Shein Win, to the stage. Poet Maw Shein Win is the first poet laureate of El Cerrito, California. Her full-length poetry collection, Storage Unit for the Spirit House, was longlisted for the PEN America Open Book Award, nominated for a Northern California Book Award for Poetry, and shortlisted for the California Independent Booksellers Alliance's Golden Poppy Award for Poetry for 2021. She was a Spring 2021 ARC Poetry Fellow at UC Berkeley. Please, Ma, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Anya and Nick, for hosting. And thank you, Johnson, David, and Paul, for your illuminating conversation. I'd like to share some poems from Storage Unit for the Spirit House. Spirit House 4. Sibling follows sibling into thorn forest. Girl holds stick of incense, tip aglow. 37 knots await atop Mount Popa. Volcanic relics, sister brother, blue-throated barbets. Lightning clue, nest lands on soft earth, entwined vines. Distant blaze, candlewick floating in bowl of oil. And this is entitled Storage Unit 202. 1. Secondhand gloves. 2. A king drinking pear juice trapped in a glass jar. 3. Wet hair and wet fur. 4. Velvet spurs. 5. Directions to the other world. The soft part of the brain. We ride our wooden bicycles along the dust path. Blooms above, we drops of sap on arms and legs. Children on electric scooters zip across freeways. Bring your toothbrush, memorize the cue cards. The soft part of the brain fits into a clear jar. Glazed wheels, roads taken, minty pillows. And this is entitled Sky Space 3. A limited edition. Annotated records for the researchers. Referred to footnotes about the survivors. How they lived, how they moved, how they breathed. opened door and let sky inside. Waterspace 1. Tree mouth of river. Sculpted ether. Incant. Branch lip of sky. Mother trapped in a tree. And this poem is from Invisible Gifts, and it's called Questions for the Silvery Moth. Does beauty hurt only in the ribs? Will the path lead to the briny ferns? Don't count your kitchens. Antelope crawls along the freeway overheads and underdogs. Do we love because we have to? Choose the one, know the golden one, a basket of flesh roses, bright blood, kind cousins. Does a cat feel? Insidious. Why do we pain? Only the Buddha knows. Who calls forth the longing? Sunny side up. When will the boat arrive? Push, repeat. What about your feathery ways? The ocean is silver because it reflects the sky. And this is my final piece, and it's called Letters from the Waiting Room. Dear H, I'm hanging out in the waiting room. I am blinking into another eye, gold shades, sirens again. Seeing another city through the window of another's window, I live in a 2-second time lapse. Dear H, I knitted a quilt for you, slivers of green lint throughout. Warmth in the waiting room now. My limbs are soft with pain. Slept last night with ears open. Noted the following: pollen drift, vessel crack, pillar bark. Dear H, missing your dry arms, crackling eyes, generous fountains. And this: you were standing on a dock and next to you a large trunk made of bone. Strangers began to gather. You sunk your hand and lifted a spinning plate from the trunk. Applause and more applause. Dear H, my cat visited me from the other world. She witnessed bliss busting from the pockets of houses open once again. Bright light from the storehouse, tinny bell tones. She could smell the dirt from behind the shed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ma, for your beautiful reading. And thank you again, Johnson, David, and Paul, for this discussion today. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we'll upload this one shortly. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Victor Espinosa, Frank Maresca, and Lyle Rexer on the artist Martin Ramirez. We conclude with a poetry reading by Lily Lady. You should now be able to turn on your microphones and say thank you and goodbye. So thank you all.
Thank you.
We'll be back.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank
Bye,
you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Johnson.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. To be continued, and thank you for the.
Definitely.
Part 3.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be
Bye,
back.
all.
Oh yeah, we have to continue. We have to continue, and with love and courage for 2222. It's 22 years of the Brooklyn Rail Anniversary staying free. And it will be free forever as long as I'm the publisher. We have a wonderful team and community of friends such as you all. So I'm grateful. We're grateful. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David.
That was
Good,
great.
Paul.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Good night.
And
all.
good day.
Good night.
Yeah, good day there.
Time for a nightcap.
We gotta
Time for lunch here.
Yes, for lunch.
Bye. Bye, Paul. Bye, Johnson.
Bye.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye, Paul.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.